Welcome, everyone, to This Explainer. Today, we're going to look at the Danish economy through a completely different lens. We aren't going to treat this like some kind of political talking point or an ideological debate. Instead, we're going to explore Denmark exactly as if it were a corporate strategy playbook. So let's break down how a country functions when it operates with a highly specific, heavily structured business model.
Right off the bat, the core question driving our exploration today is pretty simple. How on earth does a country with a top marginal income tax rate of over 55%, plus a 25% value-added tax on almost everything you buy, avoid completely scaring off global business? I mean, by traditional economic logic, that level of taxation should absolutely crush competitiveness, right? And yet, Denmark maintains a phenomenal per capita GDP of around $75,000. They literally outperform major powerhouses like the UK and Germany.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll cover the Danish economic paradox, their strategic tax structure, flexicurity and labor dynamics, investing in high productivity, the currency of public trust, and finally, threats to the model.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the Danish economic paradox. To really understand this model, we have to look at their starting point. Denmark wasn't always this massive economic powerhouse. They used to be a relatively poor agrarian society that relied heavily on dairy and meat exports. And unlike their neighbor Norway, they didn't have a giant pool of oil wealth to fall back on. But post-World War II, they made a strategic pivot to modernize and deeply integrate into global markets. That one decision laid the groundwork for their current GDP, which sits at a staggering $407 billion. They are the 35th largest economy in the world. And get this, they achieved that with just 5.9 million people. That's fewer people than live in New York City. It is absolute proof that a tiny population can generate massive global wealth through highly calculated, long-term macroeconomic planning. Moving on to Section 2, a strategic tax structure. Okay, so how do they actually fund this sprawling system without bringing economic growth to a grinding halt? Well, it isn't just a matter of high taxes across the board. It's actually a brilliant, calculated trade-off. What Denmark does is fundamentally shift the tax burden directly onto personal income and consumption. Workers pay those high income taxes, plus that massive 25% VAT. To put that into perspective, a simple morning pastry costs a quarter more just in taxes. But in exchange, employers get a massive break. They aren't bogged down with heavy payroll taxes for Social Security and unemployment like they are in places like France. Denmark intentionally shifts the cost to the individual citizen specifically to keep the business environment hyper-competitive. And the corporate incentive here is just striking. Denmark's corporate tax rate is just 22%. That actually sits below the OECD average. It's significantly lower than France at 25.8% and Germany at nearly 30%. By keeping corporate taxes low and red tape totally minimal, Denmark drives incredibly high startup rates and spurs major entrepreneurship. It's a system designed from the ground up to actively reward companies for reinvesting their profits, hiring new talent, and expanding. It just relies heavily on the individual citizens to fund the social safety net once those profits are actually distributed. All right, Section 3, flexicurity and labor dynamics. This brings us to their totally unique approach to human resources, a system known as flexicurity. Now think of this as the ultimate risk management strategy. It completely de-risks the hiring process for companies because there are very few legal restrictions on letting employees go. But at the exact same time, for workers, it entirely de-risks job loss because the state provides this massive safety net and continuous training. So here is how the mechanics of this actually play out in the real world. Step 1. Let's say a company needs to pivot quickly. They can execute layoffs without getting bogged down in expensive, drawn-out legal battles. Step 2, the laid-off worker receives up to 90% of their previous salary for up to 2 years. And then Step 3, the government actively steps in with job training to help place that worker back into the market. It's a win-win. Companies get ultimate agility and workers get ultimate financial security. Now you might be thinking, come on, if you guarantee 90% of someone's salary, doesn't that completely destroy their motivation to work? Honestly, it's a fair question, but the data proves otherwise. Denmark boasts a 77% labor market participation rate among working-age adults. That is massively high, actively outperforming the United States. It really shows that when you pair an extreme social safety net with active job placement and strong family support, like really generous parental leave, you can actually keep more people participating in the economy, not fewer. Let's dive into Section 4, investing in high productivity. Of course, having people in the workforce is only half the battle, right? You also need output. Denmark demands a massive return on its human capital. They pour nearly 6% of their GDP into education to ensure a highly adaptable workforce, and they invest over 3% directly into research and development. To give you some context, if you compare that to a peer nation like Italy, which spends just 1.4% on R&D and often struggles with stagnant productivity, the difference is night and day. Denmark's calculated spending basically creates a relentless, high-powered innovation engine. And wow, the ROI on these investments has birthed some highly specialized global giants. Just look at Novo Nordisk. They control a third of the entire global insulin supply and are now Europe's most valuable company. Then you have Maersk, commanding 14% of all global shipping. Or Vestas. Vestas is the direct result of a super calculated bet Denmark made way back in the 1970s to invest in wind power when basically everyone else was doubling down on oil. Today, Denmark produces over 50% of its electricity from wind alone. These are just incredible returns on strategic, long-term bets. Now for Section 5, the currency of public trust. So there is a pretty glaring catch to this entire business model, and it all boils down to one word: trust. An unbelievable 88% of Danes actually believe their taxes are used efficiently by the government. In a low-trust society, paying 55% of your income is going to be viewed as straight-up theft. But in Denmark, it is viewed as an efficient collective investment. This high level of public trust is literally the ultimate buy-in that allows this macroeconomic strategy and those elevated personal tax rates we discussed earlier to function at all. And that trust is constantly reinforced by incredibly low inequality. Denmark has a Gini coefficient of just 0.28, which means it's far, far more equal than the US or the UK. For example, a Danish CEO typically makes about 60 times the average worker. Compare that to nearly 290 times in the US. When you add in a progressive tax system where some low-income families even see effective negative tax rates, plus a housing market stabilized by 30-year fixed mortgages, you've essentially engineered a highly stable, deeply invested middle class. Finally, Section 6, threats to the model. But look, no business model is completely invincible, right? Denmark is currently facing some serious structural vulnerabilities that really threaten its long-term sustainability. The first big one is a demographic winter. Nearly 1 in 5 Danes is over 65. That leaves fewer working-age taxpayers to fund a system that's experiencing massive healthcare and pension cost inflation. Secondly, there's the strain of immigration. While it's absolutely necessary to fill labor shortages, integrating low-skilled migrants into a rigid, high-tax welfare state has raised complex challenges. It's led to higher unemployment in those specific groups and sparked uncomfortable questions about the sustainability of the welfare state. Lastly, their economy relies really heavily on a few niche export sectors, like pharmaceuticals and shipping, which leaves them highly exposed to sudden global trade shocks. But remember what we said earlier? Denmark's greatest strength is its long-term planning and adaptability. They are actively hedging against these exact risks right now. They're gradually raising the retirement age all the way to 70 to combat those demographic shifts. They're leveraging extreme digitization. Over 90% of the population already uses digital IDs to streamline public services. And they're leaning heavily into automation, doing everything from AI-driven diagnostics in hospitals to machine learning logistics at Maersk, specifically to offset those incoming labor shortages. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought for today's explainer. Denmark has undoubtedly engineered a masterpiece of an economy. It's this highly tailored, homogeneous business model built on immense public trust, strategic tax burdens that heavily favor business growth, and intense labor flexibility. But as the world rapidly changes, can this specific, delicate balance survive the chaos of an automated, demographically strained future? It's a fascinating question, and what happens next in Denmark is going to be an absolute masterclass for the rest of the world to watch. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep exploring.